How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weathers from 5000. Today is September 2nd, 2019, as Hurricane Dorian is just north of the Grand Bahama island and it's moving completely stationary. The steering currents, as we know, are currently weak. At this point, that upper level high that was just north of it yesterday has weakened due to this oncoming shortwave trough that pretty much weakened it and pushed that upper level high more towards the east, closer to Bermuda, and now it's much weaker, that steering current. Although we're seeing some slight southwest winds that's trying to push it towards Florida, we're also seeing the winds from this other high pressure that's just in the northern Gulf of Mexico right now, that's bringing northwest winds to the upper levels, and they're basically canceling each other out. That southwest wind from this upper level high and this northwest wind from this other high pressure that's just right by the Gulf of Mexico. But the forecast models have been right up to this point, which is definitely good news. Some Floridians were a little bit afraid that this storm might have taken the western portion of this track, which would mean a closer, too close for comfort and to even a landfall on the Florida coast. But that idea seems to be dying down at this point, as it's very unlikely to see a landfall in Florida since it's stationary right now. There's weak steering currents, but we expect this shortwave trough to the north of it, to come in just south enough to where this hurricane will find a small opening to, although still move slowly up the Florida coast, it still should move somewhere and at least should make this hurricane remain offshore of the Florida coast, which is definitely good news, as we see evidence of this trough by this abundance of dry air that's just behind this small shortwave trough that's expected to pull this thing up and hopefully completely stay offshore the United States. However, there's still questions, especially as we go more up north, where the track becomes more uncertain as we move beyond 2 to 3 days, as the Carolina coast still is not out of the woods yet in terms of a landfalling hurricane. But in terms of the hurricane itself, we see that the hurricane still looks well organized. It weakened significantly since the last time I updated you guys. This was a 185 mile per hour hurricane, which is tied with, I think, two other hurricanes for the strongest Atlantic hurricane ever, besides Hurricane Allen, which I think reached 200 mile per hour strength at one point. But that's saying a lot how strong the storm was over the Bahamas. But fortunately, it has weakened to Category 4. It's currently 140 miles per hour instead of 185 miles per hour. But when we are talking at the point of 140 miles per hour to 185 miles per hour, there isn't really much of a gap between the potential damage you may face, whether it's a 140 or 185 mile per hour storm, especially when it's staying over the same area for nearly 24 hours. You're talking about Category 5, Category 4 hurricane staying within the same island for 24 hours, as I'm hoping the best for Grand Bahama and Freeport. I'm hoping those people are okay, they're staying safe, and unfortunately, I expect extensive damage due to this, as this is just unheard of in any Atlantic hurricane, really. But however, this storm seems to be weakening mainly due to one reason, and it's because the hurricane's bringing a lot of upwelling from the bottom of the ocean, which means that cooler waters are starting to enter the top of the ocean, and cooler waters, as you know, kind of weaken the intensity and the strengthening of a hurricane, or at least slow it down to the point where this hurricane can't really maintain its 185 mile per hour strength any longer due to the cooler waters that have been upwelling due to this hurricane turning up the ocean and bringing a lot of cooler rain onto the ocean floor. And there's still light wind shear. There's still a little dry air. Pretty much everything is in its favor right now besides this upwelling, because when a hurricane stays over the same area, it usually weakens it. But However, as for the track of this, as for the future, I expect mainly weakening for the rest of its life. I don't expect this thing to really re-strengthen anymore. I think its peak intent, we already saw its peak intensity, and I don't think it should go strengthen any more than this due to the upwelling this will bring. Because this is, even though this is still going to move north to potentially warmer waters that still haven't experienced an upwelling of the cooler waters yet, it's still going to move at a snail's pace along the Florida coast to where the upwelling will still be evident and a problem for this hurricane in terms of re-strengthening. And by the time it reaches the Carolinas, I expect that trough will hinder it from developing due to the stronger wind shear that's associated with that trough. And we're just going to see that trough bring a lot of upper level winds with it, which should definitely weaken this hurricane and maybe turn it extra tropical as it goes more up north. And looking at the current the track of this, it's still remaining offshore Florida. Although there's still a slight, very slim to none possibility this makes a landfall in the Florida coast. At this point, it's pretty evident that this won't. The steering currents have proven to be very weak with this storm, and the only steering current the computer models are currently seeing is this shortwave trough that's going to come in and pull this storm up north just to miss Florida. This high pressure, since it's stationary right now, which a lot of computer models expected to happen before this northward turn, the only steering current ahead of it is this trough, this upper level high. Is it going to do anything more than just weaken and fizzle out? And this high pressure over the northern Gulf is only going to keep this storm just far enough away from Florida because of its northwest winds that this high pressure is bringing to the upper levels of this hurricane. But this trough is also associated with this northward turn, as it's expected to take this northward turn. I expect the hurricane models to be correct at this point. I was a little worried that the hurricane models might have been wrong with this turn, because when we're talking about a slow moving storm like Dorian, they tend to be unexpected, kind of like Harvey, where the computer models were having a difficult time finding out exactly where that eye will go with that hurricane, since it's so slow moving and the steering currents are so weak. But at this point, it's evident that the steering currents are weak enough to where only this trough exists and will bring it up north. And in terms of the strength, you can see it's going to maintain major hurricane status. It's expected to maintain major hurricane status till probably around Georgia, where it weakens to maybe a category 2 by the time it reaches South Carolina. And then it should weaken to category 1 and turn extra tropical somewhere off the coast of New England. And it's completely possible this hurricane stays completely offshore of the U.S. altogether, which is definitely hoped for with this hurricane, but it's certainly not out of the questions, especially when we're talking about 3 days out when it's on Thursday and Friday. It's expected to be near the Carolina coast, and you see how big this cone gets. It could go anywhere within this cone. The worst case scenario is if it takes that eastern track over South Carolina, over North Carolina, over Virginia, Maryland, and even threatening New England and the Mid-Atlantic for a little bit, but that's certainly not out of question. But the Hurricane Center, I think there's a lot less uncertainty when it comes to this forecast, unlike over here, because this storm will have a definitive steering current, which is this trough that's just going to pull it up north. So I think at this point, most of the models are agreeing that it's going to be pulled up to the northeast, hopefully away from the coast, but exactly where is going to be the question, because if it stays within the coast, that could be a problem for a lot of the East Coast to worry about in terms of flooding, even if it's a weak hurricane or a tropical storm by the time it reaches New England and New Jersey. And surprisingly, the GFS and the European have been both in huge agreement with this storm, keeping it offshore Florida and offshore the Carolinas and moving northeast far enough to where it doesn't affect much of New England or the Mid-Atlantic states. and the European says the same. As it's taking a very similar track. Maybe a landfall in North Carolina. That's still not out of the question, but mainly offshore the Mid-Atlantic and New England states. But however, even though this storm may stay offshore, impacts are still likely with this storm, even if it doesn't directly make landfall. Because as you can see, hurricane warnings are issued all throughout north of the West Palm Beach coastal areas, because there's still that possibility of hurricane force wind gusts within the immediate coastline, and sustained winds between 40 and 50 miles per hour isn't out of the question in terms of the impacts in Florida, with some rain up to 3 to 5 inches along the coast. And hurricane watches have been issued between Jacksonville all the way up to maybe Myrtle Beach, just south of Myrtle Beach, as hurricane conditions are definitely possible as the eye comes close to the Carolinas and Georgia. And I wouldn't be surprised if hurricane watches get issued the next day for North Carolina, as a hurricane may threaten to landfall along the coast. But so people in the southeast, especially in the extreme coastal regions, I wouldn't let your guard down just yet. Just because it may stay offshore, but especially in North Carolina and South Carolina, where the chances of a landfall are still higher than you think, and there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to here, because you see how big that cone is and the margin of error that is possible. But it's still definitely something to keep in mind along North Carolina, South Carolina, and heck, even the Virginia coast, and maybe the Delmarva Peninsula as well. Maybe extreme eastern portions of New England as well. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but even if this stays offshore, hurricane conditions and hurricane force wind gusts certainly are likely along the Florida coast in isolated areas, and possibly in the Carolina coast as well. So there's definitely something to keep in watch. So prepare now. This Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, I emphasize, because this storm still isn't there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to this hurricane, and you want prepared. It's better to be safe and sorry in the Carolinas, even if this makes landfall or not. But anyways, guys, I guess that's about it for this video. I thank you guys for watching, and I hope you guys have a good day and stay safe along the coast.